7 heroes. The words of President Reagan, spoken from the Oval Office today. Good evening, I'm Bernard Shaw. Larry King is away. We have many guests. We'll be hearing from you out there on this tragedy. First, let's go to New York, and our first guest tonight, a former astronaut, David Scott. Welcome, sir.
Welcome. Thank you, Bernie.
Upper stage rocketry. You know a lot about that. You've been on Apollo missions. You've been on a Gemini mission. NASA is declining to speculate today. Obviously, they want very much to have all possible information before they begin to figure out what went wrong. But because you've been up there, because you've been there before, what do you think?
Well, I agree with NASA, Bernie. We must find out what the cause of this was so that we can proceed on with the objectives of the program and do the things we want to do. And I think NASA is a good detective. NASA has demonstrated in the past that they can sift through the data, they can analyze the telemetry, and they can reach conclusions, and I believe they'll reach a conclusion very quickly in this case.
Francis Dick Scobee, Michael Smith, Judith Resnik, Ronald McNair, Ellison, Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis. One civilian, Christa McAuliffe. Should civilians be in space?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I believe that we need all types of people in space. We need to be able to develop our capabilities for further exploration in science. And I don't think space should be relegated to just the military, although there is indeed a very important role for the military to play. But yes, civilians definitely in space.
Any qualms about liquid versus solid fuel?
Well, I don't believe there are qualms. I believe that there are certain advantages to each depending on the situation in which they're being used. As an example, we're presently developing an upper stage propulsion vehicle for the shuttle, and we've chosen the liquid because of its higher reliability in the particular instances we're using. But I believe each has its role, and each has been proven in the past to be really quite reliable.
No ejection seats on Challenger. Why?
Well, I believe the system's been designed such that ejection seats are not required. As you recall, in the first 4 flights, we had ejection seats just as an added safety of margin. But I believe the shuttle reliability, and unfortunately we had a tragedy today, but in general, the reliability is such that it doesn't really require ejection seats.
Mm-hmm. One other question on this. In your judgment, did the crew, obviously we know that they did not get out alive today, but did they have a chance?
Well, that's obviously we can see from what happened today. The crew in this particular case did not have a chance, but on the other hand, they knew the chance they were taking. They're all very intelligent and educated scientists and technicians, engineers and pilots, and they know what they're doing. There's no question in their minds about the risk that they take. And yes, I've been there and I can appreciate the situation, and I believe that each of them would go again. They would understand why they're there, the purpose and the objective, and in my view, the gain and the rewards and the accomplishments far outweigh the risk.
David, please bear with us. We'll be coming back to you along with our other guest in New York in just a moment. Here in Washington with us on the Larry King program and our extended coverage of what happened today is Alex Rowland, professor of the History and Technology and Military History at Duke University. Thanks for coming up.
You're most welcome.
What are your thoughts tonight?
First of all, with Mr. Scott, I share the thought that this is a tragedy, but perhaps an occasion for us to think about the space program. And unlike him, I'm not sure that there is yet a place for civilians in space, nor am I entirely convinced that there's a necessity for any people in space at all. That is, I've yet to be convinced that it's necessary to have manned space missions. I'm of the belief that any specific mission we can identify in space, we can build a machine to do it.
A machine will replace a human being's ability to calculate, recalculate, make judgments?
Yes.
So you would question the space program
all of those things you mention aren't necessarily things that we're going to do in space. That is, if we're going to invest the money in a launch vehicle and to send a mission up into space, presumably we should know rather clearly ahead of time what it is we want to do up there, what it is we want to accomplish. And I think within those limits, we can design machines to do that capably. And of course, one of the ironies of the timing of this is that we've just seen the magnificent achievements of the Voyager spacecraft going by Uranus, a comparatively inexpensive machine doing truly remarkable things in space. When we know what we want to do, I think we're perfectly capable of building the machines to do that. Perhaps sometime in the future, we may in fact require manned spaceflight, but I don't see the need yet.
Another guest with us in New York, Jerry Gray. He's been listening to what's been saying so far. He is with the American Institute of Astronautics. What do you think about what you've heard so far?
Well, I'd love to agree with Professor Ronald, but I'm an engineer. He seems to be a professor. I think we do need people. Don't misunderstand me. We also need robot spacecraft. We also need automation. In fact, the best combination, as Dave mentioned earlier, sometimes solid propellant rockets and liquid propellant rockets are used better in combination. So people and machines are best used in combination. For example, on the Space Lab flights, we found that many of the scientific findings that we were looking for could not have been accomplished without the people on board. Because unfortunately, Professor Allen, things don't always work out exactly the way they're designed. And the best possible all-purpose computer is a human being, one that can deal with any eventuality, anything that happens in an effective way. Now, again, don't misunderstand me. I think Voyager is exactly the right machine to have done the job that it was designed to do. But we can't always tell in advance exactly what's going to happen on our space flights. I think the use of people, when they're appropriate, is absolutely essential as we advance and do more and more complex tasks. Eventually, a machine simply cannot do a task when it becomes so complex that the design of the machine requires infinite redundancy and many alternatives as to what might go on. A human being can make quick decisions and can act on them. That's where we need people.
I surely don't disagree with that, but it's a question of the relative cost of these things, and I'm not yet convinced that any of the activities that we've assigned to our astronauts is worth the cost of sending them into space. And there are two kinds of costs. One is the additional cost of making that spacecraft safe for them, which is a very severe economic cost. And the other, of course, is the human cost, the one that we're suffering today when accidents go wrong, as they're sure to do. When a machine fails in space, that's an economic loss that's replaceable. When people are lost in space, they're irreplaceable. I surely don't argue that we should never send people in space. I'm just not convinced that the missions we've sent them on so far, their presence is really indispensable.
Well, I believe it really is essential to look at the future. I agree some of the missions we're doing today are training for the future. But if we were to look at a future in space which had nothing but machines in it, I'm afraid we would really be limiting our options. Now, the cost of putting people into space is higher than that of putting machines into space, as long as the jobs to be done are simple. When the jobs get to be much more complex, it gets to be cheaper to carry along the support necessary to keep people operating and living in space. And we will be seeing this happen with the space station in the next decade, less than 10 years from now. We need to be prepared for it. We need to do the test piloting, we need to do the preparations for it, just as we did in the aviation field beforehand.
For all of you, a simple question. Are we to anticipate more tragedy as we move along with our space program?
Again, I'd like to draw on the experience that we've had in aviation. Aviation was not without its tragedies. This year probably has been one of the worst we've had in a long time. We will not bring aviation to a standstill because of accidents, however. The services to mankind are too important. We will continue. We might expect that there will be airplane crashes in the future. We might expect that there will be spacecraft accidents in the future, but nevertheless, we will continue.
Before we go to Atlanta to meet our other guest, anyone else here?
I'd like to make a comment, Bernie,
Yes, David.
I'd like to make a comment on the last point. You know, one of the reasons the tragedy is so visible is because we conduct our programs in full view of the world, totally open, and we share the data that we gather and the technology that we develop in general, we share with the world. I think this visibility sometimes is very painful for us, but in the long run, I think it pays off because the scientific community and the technological community and even the philosophical community share in a great adventure, something that expands our universe and expands our horizon. And I think I might comment on one thought that Professor Rowland has. I would submit that one of the reasons that the unmanned planetary probes and unmanned spacecraft have such great success is because of the emphasis and the impetus placed upon the space program by the manned space program. I think the budgets are sustained, and I think the unmanned probes are very important to us, and in conjunction with the manned probes, we have a very viable space program, which I believe most of us hope continue in the future.
Okay, I would surely agree with that the manned space program has given NASA the kind of visibility it needs to support some of the other perhaps less glamorous enterprises, but that's really a sad commentary on the way we make decisions about how to spend our public treasure. That is, that we don't decide on what really the best missions to do, but somehow or other we have to develop a public relations program and fly missions that are attractive to the people in order to support the other, perhaps more substantial missions.
It might also be interesting if we were to take a look at what the rest of the world is doing. The Soviets have emphasized manned spaceflight right from the beginning, even before the U.S. did. The Europeans right now and the Japanese are pushing very hard to convert their systems to manned spaceflight. They are emphasizing them at the cost of many of their other things. Even the Chinese are beginning to train astronauts and consider manned spaceflight. Whatever we do in the U.S., overseas they will be continuing manned spaceflight.
On that point, we know that you've already begun calling in. All of the lines are lit up. And when we come back, we're going to join our guest in Atlanta, a professor from Georgia Tech University, as we continue our extended coverage of the flight of the Shuttle Challenger.
All right!
Welcome back. Larry King is away tonight. I'm Bernard Shaw. We're continuing our extended coverage of what happened today down at Cape Canaveral in Florida. Joining us, our fourth guest tonight from Atlanta, Georgia Tech University professor, Gary Flandreau. You've been listening, welcome, you've been listening to what's been said so far. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's been a very philosophical discussion up to this point, and I would hope that perhaps we might talk a little bit about implications in terms of hardware development. I think we may have seen in a rather harsh way today some results of some approaches that NASA adopted early in the shuttle program in terms of the way the hardware was developed.
Are you saying that things were not done as they should have been done?
No, I'm not saying that, but I think the attitude right from the start was that the shuttle system would be based on existing technology, and that was the overriding philosophy, and therefore whenever questions came along that seemed to be of somewhat a research nature, they were really put aside, and there were some questions that came up that weren't properly addressed, in my opinion.
Which questions?
Well, these have to do with really seemingly small things in the propulsion system. I have worked as a consultant to the Air Force and to propulsion companies in the development of the solid rockets that were used in the shuttle, and there have been some problems there right along. They seem to be small, but I've warned right from the start that these might develop into something more significant. And I hope that's not what we've seen here in the tragic things that happened today.
Professor, please don't be retiring and reticent. Specifically, when you say small things, what are you alluding to?
There have been some development problems in these solid rocket boosters. Let me mention two or three of these. Perhaps the one that is most important is the problem that has been experienced with the nozzles on these motors. There have been several flights where there was evidence of the nozzle being within a hair's breadth of failure, and these were in some recent flights. Another problem has been oscillations in the gas flow in the rocket motors. This is a very common problem in solid rockets, and the amplitudes of these oscillations have been getting larger in some of the more recent flights, and there is cause for concern.
We have three other guests with us on this panel tonight. Any of you, if you feel so inclined, please respond. But since we have a former astronaut David, what about some of these things? What about the nozzles on the motors, the oscillations of gas flowing through the rockets?
Well, yes, in fact, there have been some problems with solid rocket motors in the past. I believe these have been corrected, but as you recall, a couple of satellites were temporarily lost in 1984 due to failures of solids. However, I think NASA's done its homework, and it has accomplished a very important achievement in the success of the solids. And today, as I viewed the film, I didn't see any problem with the solids. They were very straight and true. Had there been a burn-through or a nozzle problem, there would have been a corkscrew or a tumble. I didn't recognize any problem. I should hope there isn't any. I think that the conjecture or speculation of what caused the failure today is premature. I'd wait. I wouldn't bet on anything myself right now.
Barry?
I think...
Please continue, sorry.
Well, I think that we have to take a close look at the manner in which the investigation is conducted and the conclusions that are reached. And I doubt that anybody tonight, and I've talked to several people, and I doubt that anybody has an answer, and conjecture at this time, I think, is a bit premature.
Area code 202-898-7600. What do you think? Let's go to the phones. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. This is Alan Fritchie from Memphis. I'd like to ask Dave Scott, being a pilot myself, I'd like to ask him his thoughts on the psychological impact on the astronaut crews following an accident, whether it was something that happened today or, in his case, what he went through with the Apollo 1 fire 19 years ago.
Alan, you have a very good memory. As a matter of fact, I was on the backup crew to Apollo 1 until 2 months before the fire, and I can assure you within the astronaut corps, there is total resolution to continue and pick up the banner where these people unfortunately had to pass it. The dedication of the astronaut crew in Houston is no different from when I was there, and I think they would be fully behind flying as soon as possible, as soon as we can identify the cause of the failure and correct it.
Thank you very much, Memphis. Another call.
Bernard, reluctantly, I ask a question of this nature. All the discussions today tended to focus in on mechanical things that may have gone wrong. My question is this: to what degree do we know that something like this couldn't have been an act of sabotage? Reluctantly, I say I ask a question like that. What happens at NASA and at the Kennedy Center to assure the security of the orbiter and all the hardware that goes along with it?
David, you've lived in that environment. You've shuttled back and forth to where the crew's headquarters is located. What about security at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral?
Well, in my experience, when I was at the Cape, security was extremely good. In fact, we knew the chief of security quite well down there and had great confidence in his ability to maintain the security of the pad and the whereabouts and the hardware. As a matter of fact, I used to run on the beach in the morning, and I was told at some point that they watched me every step of the way. I think security is very tight, and they're very conscious of not only the value of the hardware, but the value of the lives involved.
Let's listen to another caller now. You're on the air.
Yes, sir. I'm calling from Montgomery. This is Ted Kickrider. I'd like to address this to the professor from Duke University. I would like to know the reasons why he thinks we should go back and use machines and computers and all that instead of men in space.
It's not really going back because, of course, we've been using machines since the beginning of the space program. And I'm not suggesting that we should entirely abandon manned space flight. There may be, in fact, be missions in which having the crew on board can significantly improve the capabilities. But with each manned flight, we run tremendous risk. That is, we run greatly increased cost of sending that crew along, and we run the risk of the kind of accident that happened today that inevitably in this kind of enterprise, which we must remember is a very dangerous enterprise, is bound to happen again. And I would like us to think more than we do about the cost of sending men into space and not do it unless we can clearly demonstrate that there's a payoff equal to that risk.
Our telephone number, area code 202-898-7600. Let's hear from another viewer.
Hello.
Thank you for calling.
Yes, I was wondering if, in light of the fact of all the flights they have scheduled for this year, if this could be a safety problem and kind of trying to rush things.
Gentlemen?
That sort of thought just has to pass through your mind, especially with the troubles that the last shuttle flight had and then the troubles that this one had getting off. I would be very much surprised if the people who had to make the decision about whether or not to launch were influenced by that pressure. That is, I think they demonstrated in the last flight that they would resist the pressure however long they had to until they were sure of a safe launch and a safe return, and I just don't believe that played a role today.
Well, the NASA briefing today, they did say, they were asked that very question, and they said there was no pressure. There was no pressure to get this launch off prematurely.
I'm not sure I'd say it quite that categorically, but I think they resisted I think the pressure was intense, but I think they resisted it.
If I can add something to that, I think in the past, NASA has, if anything, been accused of being ultra-conservative. On some of the delays on previous flights, we have sometimes had the impression that that flight could have gone, but NASA was just being so ultra-careful in order to preserve the lives of their astronauts and their vehicles that I think the argument that they suddenly decided to be relaxed and say, oh, what the hell, let's go, I think that doesn't hold in this case. I really feel that before the decision was made to launch, it was considered that everything was properly ready for launch today. I can't believe that they changed their attitude so quickly.
Well, I think they're...
Bernie, I'd like to make a comment, too, relative to the delays. Because of the visibility of this program, delays are always outward and shown and in the press. It can be shown, I believe, by studies that the manned spaceflight program, the shuttle in particular, has fewer delays and gets off the pad faster from the time it's assembled vertically than any expendable launch vehicle in our inventory. It is a very successful program and very timely compared to other launch vehicles.
Let's hear from another caller. You're on the air.
Hi, Bernie.
Hi there.
Good job.
Thank you.
Mr. Scott, you've had some eloquent things to say, and so has Jake Garn today. My comment is directed, I think, at Professor Rowland. We have logged, the Space Shuttle program, has logged 50 million miles without an accident. We haven't had this kind of a catastrophic event in 26 years. Your comments with regard to non-manned space travel, I think, is irrelevant. And I just don't understand it. Yes, it is catastrophic. I think the people that are involved understand the risks. And this kind of thing, while it can elicit our sympathy, your comments, I think, are unwarranted. That's all I had to say.
There are two kinds of risks, I would suggest. Indeed, all the people who volunteer to be astronauts take the risks associated with the flight, and they know them much better than most of us do. But all the rest of the American taxpayers take a risk as well. That is, we pay considerable amount of extra money for these manned flights, and my concern is simply that we're not getting our money's worth out of that money that we're paying for manned spaceflight.
Let's hear from another viewer. You're on the air. Thanks for calling.
Yes, hello?
Hello.
Yeah, I'd like to ask astronaut David Scott if there is a way that the technicians can do NDI, non-destructive inspections of various components within the shuttle systems and any other type of material inspection prior to a flight. And if that could be well, obviously it could be a possible factor, but if there's a way they could do this at the last minute.
Well, they do this. They do this throughout the testing of the vehicle and the preparation for the launch. It's a very intensive and thorough testing from the component and the element through the subsystem to the system. And in fact, NDT and NDI are the kinds of things that NASA's a forerunner on. So I think the technology and the technicians do everything we know today in order to ensure the safety and the integrity of the vehicle before it's launched.
We're going to go to thank you for calling. We're going to go to another viewer who's waiting, as are many viewers on all our lines, but we want to thank David Scott, former Apollo and Gemini astronaut, before he gets away. He has another commitment, and he's going to be easing out very shortly. But David, we wanted to thank you right now for coming in.
Thank you, Bernie. I enjoyed the questions very much.
Thank you. Let's go to line 9. You're on the air.
Yes, sir. I was wondering about the possibility of pilot error on this. I know it's a far-fetched idea, but I'd seen earlier where the shuttle was rigged to self-destruct. Should it go off course, whatever, toward a major city?
David, it sounds like that question has about 3 or 4 elements. What about the step-by-step process? He's gone?
David seems to be disconnected, so why don't I take that one over? And
yes,
let
please
you know. The shuttle at this point in the flight is still under the control of the computers. The pilots have not as yet taken control. The operation is principally from the ground. With regard to a self-destruct, the shuttle is not equipped with self-destruct devices. No manned spacecraft are. Unmanned spacecraft are often equipped with self-destruct devices to avoid damaging anything on the ground. I think that covers the question that was asked.
Caller, are you alluding to the booster?
Well,
or the spacecraft? You're talking about the booster.
No, the boosters, the 2 solid rocket boosters, do have destruct devices on board, but actually they are parachuted into the water. The problem here today certainly did not seem to be the solid rocket boosters. As David mentioned earlier, all of the photography indicated that they continued on course pretty much as you might expect after the destruction of the vehicle.
Okay, Jerry.
Problem, yeah, go ahead. That's enough. I think I've covered it.
Okay, but caller, just before we cut away, before we return, you were referring to the booster. I just want to be clear about our terminology because
yes,
some of this...
Yes, sir.
Okay, you were talking about the boosters rather than the space shuttle itself.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for calling. 202 is the area code, 898-7600. This is our continuing coverage of the tragedy that occurred today. Larry King is away, and we'll be right back with more of your phone calls and more responses from our guests. Welcome back to our extended coverage of what happened today with the Challenger shuttle. We are getting more phone calls. Which line should we go to? Let's go to line 1. You're on the air.
Yes, good evening, sir. My name is James Bursall from New York, and I have 2 questions, if I may, to the professor, if he possibly can answer it. Number 1, yesterday, a hatch door lock got jammed, and when the technicians came up to repair it, the equipment did not operate. Namely, the battery was dead in the drill. This shows that there is some type of coordination that is not proper on the maintenance staff. The second question would be on computers. Computers operate extremely quickly. The computer would operate much quicker than human mind could to separate the shuttle from the rocket. This, in fact, did not happen. Why, or do they have a backup where the computer will separate the vehicle from the rockets? This would be my question. Thank you kindly.
Okay, if that was addressed to me, 2 parts. First of all, the sort of comedy of errors we saw yesterday with the door latch. I think, as Mr. Scott said, that's just because NASA has been so open about this program. That is, they allow cameras in to cover every detail of a launch, and inevitably, with that kind of complex technological enterprise, that sort of thing is going to happen, and it's a great embarrassment when it's broadcast coast to coast. The other question, I think, is perhaps more significant. That is, why didn't the orbiter separate from the fuel tank when something started to go wrong? And again, we are just speculating, but my guess would be that this was a catastrophic failure, one entirely unanticipated by any of the programs that were put into the computers. Those programs there, the safety programs, are there to save the orbiter in the event of an engine shutdown, a fuel failure or something that might be anticipated. This seems to have been entirely unanticipated catastrophic failure, and the computer simply couldn't do anything about it and probably didn't have time to do anything about it.
Professor Flandreau, do you have any thoughts on that from Georgia Tech and our Atlanta Bureau?
I certainly agree that this is something that just happened much too rapidly for the computers to really save the spacecraft. It was in a very vulnerable spot, really a point in the flight where you just really couldn't save it from that kind of an explosion. I wonder if we could come back, though, to the point about whether there might have been some question of NASA being a little bit in a hurry to get this flight off. I do have some concerns here. And this again goes back to the behavior of the propulsion system, especially under the very low temperature environment that the spacecraft was allowed to be in for several days. It's well known that the propulsion system can be adversely affected, and I think it's true that these motors that are used, the two solid boosters in particular, have not been qualified really to operate at that low a temperature.
To our caller in New York, we thank you. Let's go again to another viewer. You're on the air.
Yes, hello there.
Hello.
I was concerned about this is a reusable vehicle. Okay, the hydrogen tanks on that vehicle, is it possible it's getting wore out, and how do they check this?
Jerry Gray?
I think I can answer that. The hydrogen tank, in fact, the large propellant tank, is the only major component on the shuttle system that is not reusable. It's a brand new tank for every flight. The tank is the one item that's disposed of in the ocean after it served its purpose. So it could not have been worn out or improperly designed in any other way. It was simply a brand new tank.
Okay, let's go to another viewer. You're on the air.
Yes, I'd like to ask the professor from Georgia Tech, given the pictures that we saw today, what are the actual chances that anything will be found which was wrong with the shuttle, or will it never be known?
Well, I think that our best hope is to get some of the telemetry data and also any flight recordings that might hopefully have survived. I think that's our best hope of discovering what really indeed happened. There's a little evidence in the photographic coverage, but of course it's very difficult to make any really firm decisions on that basis alone. So we're going to have to wait for the detailed telemetry data to really discover what happened.
There were some excellent camera photos taken that have not yet been released downrange, and my understanding is that they are very high quality, and when they are computer enhanced and blown up, that there may be some additional information available as well. Although I agree with Professor Flandreau, the bulk of the useful information will probably come from the telemeter data.
Does anyone have any idea how long it's going to take NASA to pull together an investigation?
Well, if I were NASA, I would have everybody in the place working 24 hours a day until they find out, because this is obviously something that needs to be established before the program can continue, and everyone at NASA is committed to that continuation.
Let's hear from another viewer. You're on the air.
Hello, I'm calling from College Park, Maryland. I want to respond to the professor from Duke's allegation, if I could.
Please do.
He is saying that we shouldn't send manned space flights into outer space, and that's good in some cases when you're sending a probe out to Jupiter or Uranus, like the Voyager 2 mission. But what do you do when something like solar maximum malfunctions in outer space? And you need to repair the thing, and it'd be better if you went up with a manned space flight and repaired it, rather than sending another solar maximum up, which would cost at least twice the amount of money. You were talking about the reason we want to send manned space flight. We don't want to send manned space flight up is because you want to save money, but in this case, you'd be spending more money than you would if you sent the space shuttle up to fix something like this.
Okay, well, that's a very good point. In fact, the rescue of the Solar Max mission might have been the most dramatic success of the shuttle so far, the clearest demonstration of the usefulness of man in space. But remember that we were able to put man in space before we developed the shuttle, before we invested the $14 or $15 billion that we've put into that, and we can buy a lot of solar maximum missions for $14 or $15 billion.
Okay, let's quickly go to another viewer. Thanks for calling.
Yes, this is just an observation. It's not a question. I realize the grief of the moment is overwhelming in a situation like this, but I feel a large percentage of the population in America would still give almost anything to go on a trip such as the shuttle and be on the leading edge of technology and discovery. I feel it would be a shame to see this program shut down because of a setback, and I hope that that will not come to be in the future. That's really all I had.
Bernie, I'd like to add a comment to that, too.
Yes, I was going to ask you, is there really any possibility that this program would be shut down?
Oh, I don't think there's really a possibility of that, but I would like to give a more personal reaction to the caller's view. I've applied to be one of the first journalists in space. Now, I don't know whether or not that program will continue in view of what happened today, but I am fully prepared, as soon as we find out what happened to this vehicle, to take my place on that flight if they would have me. And I think this reaction is typical of many of us in this country, and I fully agree with the man who called in from Kansas.
Could I add to that?
Yes, please.
I'd also like to amplify that point of view. I think many of us have wished that we could fly. I would still jump at the chance to fly on a shuttle mission, even if it was the next one to go next week, regardless of what happened today. And I think that those people that lost their lives today fully realized that they were in a risk situation, and I think they knew what it was that they had on the line.
Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. We'll continue our quest in space. That's what President Reagan said from the Oval Office at 5 o'clock, roughly 5 o'clock Eastern Time this afternoon in his public response to what has happened. Area code 202-898-7600. We want to thank our guest in New York, Jerry Gray, who's with the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. He's going to have to leave us very shortly. We have time for another phone call in this segment. Let's go to the telephone and see whether we can hear from another viewer. Let's go here. You're on the air.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was wondering where the pad hasn't been used in almost 10 years or over 10 years. I was wondering if that had any possibility of damaging the craft when it took off or anything like that.
Jerry, any thoughts on that, or has he already left?
No, I'm still here.
Okay, thank you.
I don't think it's likely. If something had happened right at launch, that could be certainly a possibility. The fact that the flight was already 1 minute past, and that's well down range, means the chances of some damage that would not have shown up earlier are slim. It is a possibility, but I would think it's one of the slimmest of the ones that have been proposed.
As you sit out in the audience watching CNN, wherever you are, here in the United States or elsewhere around the world, certainly the callers from our viewers have varied very greatly, depending on one's knowledge and background. And perhaps some of the men and women in NASA are appalled or delighted with the quality of some of the questions. But today's tragedy has all of us thinking. And when we come back, we'll hear from a psychiatry professor from the University of Chicago who deals in child psychiatry. And we're going to hear from him and hear from you, because as President Reagan indicated, and as we know, because of one of the crew members on the Challenger shuttle, there was intense interest by the nation's young people in what was to have been Challenger's mission. We'll return with our continued coverage and our extensive coverage of what happened today in just a moment. A very long, a very reflective day. We appreciate your phone calls tonight on this extended coverage of what's happened. Our guest now is Dr. Bennett Leventhal. He's the Director of Child Psychiatry at the University of Chicago. And that 5-minute address that President Reagan made from the Oval Office today, at one point we, in our live coverage, I can recall saying that the President was fulfilling his role as Commander-in-Chief and also as the leader of the United States of America, grieving with all of us and certainly with the families and the survivors of these 7 Americans, but also seeking to inspire the young people, Christa McAuliffe, aboard that spacecraft. Psychologically, to the millions of young people who are so involved in this mission today, how do you counsel them?
Well, I think there are a number of issues that are very important, and the first and foremost is that this was something with which young people could identify. An astronaut or a president or a congressman is someone who's vague and distant. A teacher is a very real person to most young people. They have teachers, and they're people with whom they readily identify. And I think we all, but particularly the young people, readily identified with Miss McAuliffe. And to see her and to see what has happened to her as she's gone through the experience of training, but also preparing us and preparing our children to learn from her in space, I think involved them a great deal, much differently than many of the other space programs. And for them, this was a particularly critical time and very disappointing. And I think one of the best things we can do for them is to tell them that we share their disappointment and to listen to them and to understand from them in their own words and their own thoughts what the disappointment means to them. And when we do that, then we'll be able to learn how best to help them get through the time.
Dr. Leventhal, it's difficult to think back to age 8, 9, 10, and up to especially the ages of the people at Concord High School where she taught in Concord. But for a young person, for a young mind, is this too much reality too soon?
I don't think young people are afraid of reality or unable to comprehend it. I think what they need from us as adults is the kind of guidance and direction so that they can handle reality and they can incorporate it into their life's experience. So it becomes, in part, our responsibility as adults, and most particularly their parents and their teachers, to help them incorporate this experience and to say that, although it is a terrible tragedy, there are things that they can learn from it as well.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave, the president said at one point in addressing his remarks specifically to young people. What was he trying to do there with that phrase?
Well, I think he's trying to tell young people, as we all would like to tell them, that there's a certain risk in doing something new and different, in reaching out to a new frontier, and that risk sometimes leads to injury or even death, but that doesn't mean we should stop. That in youth and in our new knowledge, we can find hope for not making the same mistakes and moving ahead. And I think young people are willing and able to hear that message from their elders.
I'm thinking now about Mrs. McAuliffe's husband, who's still in Florida, their little son, young son, and their daughter. How do you get your kids to, of course, remember a mother who was so important to them, and to remember what she was striving to do, and have them walk away from this with a positive attitude?
Well, you only have one mother, and when you lose that mother, no matter what the circumstances, be it circumstances such as today or any others, it's a terrible tragedy and will have a lasting impact on these children. And I think it will only be a positive experience for them, in whatever way it can be positive, if their father and the friends around them can continue to tell them about what their mother was that was good, and let them express their very strong feelings, both sadness and anger and disappointment, to people that are willing to listen. And this isn't a time to say, be tough and don't cry. It's a time to say whatever you feel is okay. And I might add that that's true for all the young people who are older people who have experienced this terrible tragedy today.
I'm thinking about also the children of the other astronauts aboard the Challenger.
It's a terrible experience for them, and I think that it's one that we know from our studies about grieving that it will take months, if not years, for them to fully understand and fully recover from the impact of today.
Area code 202-898-7600. When we return, we'll hear from you on the telephone. Dr. Bennett Leventhal, Director of Child Psychiatry at the University of Chicago, and we're going to go to your telephone calls. You're on the air.
Hi, I have 3 young children that we're about to take our first plane ride with next week, and they've been very apprehensive to start with. How do I get them over this crisis?
Well,
what they saw today.
Since I don't know your children, it's difficult to be very specific, but I think whenever a child faces a new experience, and particularly one about which they might be apprehensive, there are 2 things that are very critical. One is their parents' responses, and I think if you can make yourself as comfortable as you can with the experience, that in and of itself will help your children. But secondly is to ask them what they're worried about, and you will hear from them certain perceptions or fears, some of which are quite realistic and some of which are not. And if you can separate for them the reality from the misperceptions, you'll do them a great service and help them deal with the situation appropriately. And finally is not to dismiss the fact that there's a certain risk in going on an airplane, as there is in crossing the street, as there is in doing many other things, and that being a little bit fearful isn't always a bad thing.
If your child says to you, I don't want to die, I'm afraid of dying, I'm too young to die, how do you counsel that child?
Well, I think if they say they're afraid to die, then you ask them what they're afraid of, and try to help them articulate it. If they say they don't want to die, that they're too young to die, if they're very young children, I think it's important as parents to tell the child that you can do that they're right, they are too young to die, and you're going to do everything in your power to protect them from death and illness or anything else that can do them harm. And that's a very comforting piece of information for them to hear again and again.
Let's go to another caller. You're on the air.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask if the doctor feels like maybe it was mishandled in Concord in that high school they shouldn't have shoved those kids out the door. Wouldn't it have been better to keep them inside the auditorium where they could know what was going on?
Well, since I wasn't there, I really can't comment directly on what they did. It's my understanding that they didn't shove them out the door, but rather returned them to their classrooms where, in small groups, they could talk to their own teachers about what had happened in the experience. And then later they returned to the auditorium to share it as a group and to get updated on the information. If that's what they did, it seems perfectly reasonable. Again, I think it's hard to generalize for all people, and one has to trust that the people that were responsible for those children, the principals and teachers, were handling it in the best way they could at the time.
I had the feeling, as we saw the principal speaking, that this indeed, the faculty members down to the janitor, as well as the student body, they were watching this on live television, many of them, that this was actually a tragedy within a very special family.
Oh, I think there's no question about it, and we all know that within our own communities, but this is one which came at a time of great hope, expectation, and went from a high degree of enormous joy and happiness to the pits of despair, and such a dramatic change is very difficult to comprehend and very difficult for anybody to handle, even for those of us who are somewhat removed and just watched it on television, even sometime later.
Let's hear from our next caller. Thanks for calling.
Yes, I was wondering if the children of the astronauts today were given counseling immediately by NASA, or if they have to return to their own hometowns to get counseling. The families seemed to be ushered off right away, and they disappeared. And there were children crying, some were laughing because they weren't aware of what was going on. And I was just wondering if NASA was trying to handle the families, or if they were just left on their own.
Well, I can't tell you specifically what NASA did or what arrangements they made. I am familiar with some of the programs that the military has for providing immediate counseling service for families whose spouses or parents have been lost in action. And I would presume that they would avail themselves of these services.
And for those who were down at the VIP section at the Cape watching the launch of the Challenger, they actually immediately got them and took them out of the stands and took them away. And as part of this effort, President Reagan asked Vice President Bush to fly down there, as he did with Senators Glenn of Ohio and Garn of Utah. We understand that they're en route back to Washington. 202-898-7600. Do we have time to go to one more phone call? Real quick, let's go to line 2. You're on the air.
Hello, I'm calling from Austin.
Yes, please go ahead.
My call is more in relation to the gentlemen that were on the show earlier, not to the child psychologist. I just wanted to ask those people what they felt that there was a lot of talk about cost and how all this is being funded.
Well, unfortunately, those other 3 guests have departed, but we thank you for calling. We also thank you, Dr. Leventhal, for coming in. When President Reagan addressed the nation earlier today, the president concluded his statement with a quotation saying in part, the Challenger, the crew, slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Those words were written by John Gillespie McGee, Jr. He was a 19-year-old American volunteer with the Royal Canadian Air Force. McGee was killed in training on December 11th, 1941. If we look to the heavens, as all of them did, the people aboard the Challenger, we can see hope, we can feel comfort in our anguish, and we can know resolve. I'm Bernard Shaw. Larry King was off tonight. The CNN Evening News is next with Don Farmer and Chris Curl.
Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Challenger, go with throttle up. 1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance.
Much of the rest of the world mourned with America today over the shuttle disaster, and we have more on that now from CNN's Peter Humey reporting from London.
The American embassy in London received hundreds of messages of sympathy. Inside, Ambassador Charles Price had watched the disaster unfold on television. He probably summed up most people's reaction to the tragedy.
Well, I think it was one of extraordinary shock and a feeling of immense sorrow for the families who have suffered as a result of this tragic accident.
Did you find that people stopped for a moment in the embassy when they realized what was happening?
Well, I think everything came to an abrupt halt.
Americans in London were stunned by the news.
I'm so sorry.
It's like devastating. Should put us back a couple of years.
I'll say.
Yeah, we have a lot of pride in it. The crew and the astronauts, and to have something like this happen, it's kind of hard to put into words exactly. You just never expected it.
The Queen, in a message to President Reagan, expressed her shock and sadness. It was tragic, her message said, that the past success of the shuttle missions had taken its price in brave young lives. By coincidence, in London Tuesday evening, British businessmen from the space industry were meeting for dinner. They too were horrified by the tragedy. Later, some turned their thoughts to the implications for the commercial future of space.
In general terms, the situation we are faced with is that the shuttle has been sold as a very reliable launch vehicle. It has to be reliable because it carries up to 7 astronauts on each flight. It has been rated as a very reliable vehicle, and we have seen today an inevitable total loss.
The dinner went ahead after a minute's silence. All day, British television news had run extra programs.
The space shuttle explodes. The 7 crew are dead. Good evening. The American...
Late bulletins were specially extended with the shuttle tragedy reported in great detail. And it was to those final few moments of Challenger that the bulletins returned to close their shows. Peter Humey, CNN, London.
Soviet television showed the explosion of Challenger on its evening news program. Some Soviet citizens expressed shock and sadness at the American disaster. CNN's Stuart Lurie has the story from Moscow.
The Soviet people learned quickly of the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. TASS, the official news agency, reported the tragedy a half hour after it happened. Then the main evening television news show, Vremya, showed the liftoff and the explosion. That was less than 2 hours after it actually happened. The narrator used grave tones in describing the scene, tones usually used respectfully for obituaries of important officials here. He told his viewers there are practically no chances that any of the crew members survive. He noted that the shuttle had no ejection systems for its crew. The viewers were also told that the purpose of the mission was to place a communications satellite and instruments to observe Halley's Comet in orbit. 2 unmanned Soviet spaceships will fly by Halley's Comet in early March and return close-up pictures of it, if they work properly. The Soviets have lost 4 cosmonauts in space accidents. One died when his spacecraft's parachute tangled during a landing in 1967. 3 others were killed at the completion of a 23-day flight in 1971. A valve went bad while they were re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. Soviet authorities minimized the chances of showing such disasters on television by rarely televising launches or landings live. They do that only on special occasions, such as when foreigners are aboard. In the past, the Soviets have criticized the space shuttle program for its military purposes, but none of that criticism was mentioned in the report on the explosion. Stuart Lurie, CNN, Moscow.
Viewers in Japan also today were able to see the launch and the explosion of the space shuttle live on television. CNN's Mark Dolmage has the story now from Tokyo.
A half a world away in Japan, television viewers saw the same horrifying live pictures of the shuttle exploding. It was late night in Tokyo when co-anchors at JCTV picked up CNN's live coverage with Tom Mintier of what at first appeared to be a routine launch. But when it burst into an enormous fireball, they, like millions of others, were not sure what had happened. It took them a few minutes to realize the extent of the tragedy, and you will hear a typical Japanese sound of surprise, horror, shock, when he suddenly knows that 7 astronauts have perished.
Co-pilot Michael Smith, Judith Resnik, Ronald McNair.
On the streets of Tokyo before dawn Wednesday morning, the reaction was what you'd expect just about any place in the world. Shock, disbelief, and sadness.
I'm very surprised of your saying now everything has gone wrong.
Early morning workers speaking both Japanese and English urged that America not allow the tragedy to end its space efforts. American viewers should be cautioned, too, that while they may appear to be smiling, it's rather a look of astonishment.
Space shuttle, Stitter. I don't know how to say it, Brian.
It's sad, but things like this lead to the progress of science. As one Japanese citizen, I hope that the next flight is successful.
Japanese newspapers, already gone to bed with their early morning issues, quickly shifted gears and got the shuttle disaster onto the front page in late or special editions. Millions of early morning rush hour workers Wednesday morning were able to read about initial reports of the tragedy. Finally, 3 Japanese were selected last August by NASA to begin training as astronauts in the United States. One of them is a female. It's too soon, of course, to say what effect Tuesday's explosion will have on the foreign astronaut program. Mark Dolmage, CNN, Tokyo.
All across the country, Americans watched today's tragedy unfolding as it happened on television. The space age and TV have been linked closely through the years, both in times of trauma and triumph. CNN's Lee Leonard reports from New York.
The United States space program, its triumphs and its tragedies, has unfolded on television since the first 7 astronauts were introduced on the then black and white TV screens of the nation. President Kennedy announced his dream of the conquest of space on TV.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills.
The first major hero to emerge from the space program was John Glenn. His orbital flight and ticker tape parade held the nation entranced.
Space shots, as we all remember, were really the first regularly scheduled special events in which we knew that the American people would kind of come together in front of their television sets and partake in something communal, you could almost say.
More recently, TV cameras have been installed on the space vehicles themselves, and we've seen not only the astronauts walking in space, but have been able to see the big blue marble as they do from the spacecraft. When American astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped out onto the surface of the moon, the whole world was indeed watching and was enthralled. Skylab, the American-Russian space link-up, deep space pictures from the unmanned Voyager showing us Uranus. All of these wonders have come to our living rooms through television. Maybe too wondrous and too commonplace as the shuttle flights became as ordinary as regularly scheduled airline flights. And then we were shocked as on a clear, cold Florida morning, the same TV cameras that had shown us success after success suddenly showed the Challenger shuttle going up in a ball of flame. Mission Command went silent, and still America watched on television. Lee Leonard, CNN, New York.
And that is our report to this hour. But CNN's coverage of the aftermath of the shuttle tragedy is not over.
Newsnight is next. Patrick Emery and Beverly Williams will keep you up to the minute on late developments. We thank you for joining us this evening. Good night.